Let's all come to order. I don't know if you've been following social media, but there is frenzied speculation that the Prime Minister will call an election this afternoon. I have no idea whether to invest that with complete credibility, but I did hear from Grant Shapps' people that they were having an extra cabinet meeting this afternoon. So with that in mind, we have a fantastic panel for you now, namely David Lammy and John Healey, the front bench Defence and Foreign Affairs, or Foreign Affairs and Defence leads for the Labour Party. So please join me in welcoming them both to this conference. Yeah, just...
Should I sit over there? Or?
There, and David, you go in the middle. And then,
Sorry, Mark.
Hi, John, nice to see you again.
Here? On the other side?
Yeah, that's great, David. No, I'm not going to sit in the middle because it's not one of those ones where the geography is refereeing because you're on the same side. So I'll sit out on this flank. Now, look, obviously I mentioned to the audience a lot of speculation about a general election and therefore clearly intense interest in Labour Party positions on foreign affairs and defence. Now, when we saw the Keir Starmer 6 first steps pledge, there was no place in the world or national security in there. A lot of people said, well, that's ridiculous in these dark times. Could you come back on that and say, were you number 7 on that notional list? But it's just we didn't realise that. Or why it is that foreign affairs and defence didn't rank higher on those leaders' first steps.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for having us, and thank you for having us together, Mark. This feels a bit like the House of Commons chamber, actually. There's 550 delegates this year signed up for the London Defence Conference and only 380 seats. So for those of this standing room at the back, welcome as well. Quite simply because Keir Starmer has served in government like David and I. He recognises the first duty of any government is to keep the country safe. It is a foundation for anything else a nation or a government wants to do. So sound economic management, strong national security, secure borders. When we launched our 5 missions, if you like, which were the groundwork for what have become the 6 first steps for change that we would take as a down payment of much bigger changes over a decade of renewal if Labour gets into government, mean that they're not part of the 6 steps, but they're fundamental to anything that we as a nation can succeed in doing or any government can do. And so it's not been an argument within the Labour Party, and it is part of the signal of the way that the Labour Party has changed under Keir Starmer.
David.
Well, I think between John and I, you've got certainly over 50 years of political experience here. And
he's aged better than
and we know, we were just saying that I always say in a general election campaign, my constituency is not a bellwether of who's going to win the election. And John and I are usually together at some point in Yorkshire or the East Midlands campaigning and knocking on doors. And the truth is, we've both been knocking on people's doors for the last few months. They aren't raising security and foreign affairs. They're raising cost of living, they're raising the National Health Service, they're raising crime in their neighbourhoods. They do understand, however, that cost of living particularly is driven by foreign policy, world events, and they're certainly worried at a more dangerous time. So in a sense, the next steps reflect what people are saying on the doorstep to us. And I've been absolutely clear that a Foreign Office under us, if we have the privilege of winning the next general election, has to be centred on growth and economic security. That's absolutely essential.
You've both been in Ukraine recently. Do you think Or do you worry that maybe what you're hearing on the doorsteps reflects either that the public haven't yet woken up to the seriousness of this moment, or in some sense have got it wrong? Does it worry you what you saw in Ukraine, and do you think you need to make that message more energetically about the gravity of this moment in European security?
Well, I think that across the board, and we all as policymakers have some responsibility, though I think elected government ministers have the lead. We've not done enough to make clear that defence of the UK starts in Ukraine. But having said that, more than 800 days after the full-scale invasion was launched, the UK continues to be united for Ukraine. It is extraordinary across the board. The churches, community groups, trade unions are still raising aid and getting it out to Ukraine, that over 140,000 Ukrainians are housed by British families in this country. And the reason that we went to Ukraine and we went together is that this is a critical moment for Ukraine. It's clear they need our help now. It's clear that we have to give them the tools to beat Putin, not just to stop Putin. And we went at this point ahead of a general election because we believe it's very important to take the politics of UK support for Ukraine out of any run-up to a general election. So our message was quite simple, whether it was the President in his office, the Foreign Minister, the Defence Minister, the parliamentarians from all parties that we met, and it's simple. It was, there will be a general election in Britain. There may be a change of government, but there will be no change in Britain's resolve to stand with Ukraine, to confront Russian aggression, or to pursue Putin for his war crimes.
Yes, look, I think it was very important for John and I to be in Ukraine last week. We were there at the same time as Antony Blinken. It's hugely important that we have not made or not sought to make standing with Ukraine a partisan issue. It's a complete cross-party issue. And in fact, our foreign counterparts and defence counterparts said to us, look, the only election we're not worried about this year is in the UK, because there is no change of position. That's really very, very important. As I say, I think that our history really in this country, the fact that, you know, men and women died fighting an horrendous fascism in the Second World War. Of course, there is real concern and worry about Vladimir Putin means that the sort of resolve and support for Ukraine that we pick up, and we see also in the sorts of focus group and polling that comes our way, is very strong in this country. And of course, we were able to take that to Ukraine. And let me just say, my own impressions from being there was the resolve in the country, the fact that even if aid were to depart, they would continue fighting. I'm quite sure about that. I think that we lose the sense of innovation and commitment in the country. Everybody engaged like a blitz spirit in an effort to win the war, not just those on the front line, but in terms of industry and business and the innovation that we're seeing in technology to help win that war that's emerging in the country. And of course, I was struck also. We went to Bucha and saw the massacre there, just weeks after we'd left in January 2022 and Irpin. So we were just hugely struck emotionally by how war has affected the country. Of course, for them, this begun back in 2014. And our commitment, not just to the Ukrainians, but to European security, is very, very important. And therefore, the Defence and Security Pact that we are offering the European Union is very, very important, I think, strategically for us and for the European continent over the years ahead.
So the bipartisan message from Britain was extremely welcome in Kyiv. But also, they welcome the fact that we were there together. They're not used to seeing that from the UK. And it's important because this is not just a military war. It's clear this is a diplomatic war, an economic and industrial war as well. And David and I have done 7 visits together overseas. We've many ambassadors and others together. And if we do win the backing to get into government, then we will continue that 2+2 in government. We will continue to do joint visits, we'll get joint submissions, and we'll consider setting up more joint FCDO MOD units, just like the NATO unit. And the important point behind this is it isn't just that we get on well, or that indeed you can't divorce security now from every country's foreign policy interest. It's the division and the infighting that has been there within government over recent years has damaged Britain's standing. And
right.
You only need to look at Ben Wallace's article in the Telegraph today to draw the distinction between two senior Labour figures sitting together, and Ben Wallace saying, look, it's hard to think of the low point in my relations with the Foreign Office because there were so many.
Let's assume that, as some people are saying, it's a sort of 1997 moment. Now, I can recall going to the Locarno room and hearing Robin Cook talking about foreign policy with an ethical dimension. On the other hand, we've seen you in Washington recently meeting people around Trump and preparing for that very real possibility. And then there's someone saying, oh, you've described yourself as a small C Conservative politician. Where are you on the arc, David, in terms of your values and your sense of what Britain's foreign policy should be between realpolitik, national pragmatism, perhaps towards a Trump administration, and idealism, progressive values, foreign policy with an ethical dimension?
Well, what I set out in my Foreign Affairs article, which I think will centre a Labour administration, I happen to believe it's fundamentally the right place for the country to be in, is a progressive realist approach to foreign policy. Now, actually, the progressive opportunity is important because we're having this conversation at a time when democracies are on the slide. 71% of the world is not living with a free media, and sadly, our own country has too often been prepared to break up the rule of law and our understanding of international norms. So progressive is important. But what I wanted to emphasise was the realist bit. It's the bit of our tradition that comes from Ernest Bevin. Mm-hmm. It's the parts of the Labour Party that set up NATO. It's the part of the Labour Party that is committed to the nuclear deterrent and was so important in setting up that architecture after the Second World War. If you want to solve the problems in the Middle East or play a role in that, you have to be realist about your engagement with very important powers in the Gulf particularly to get to that two-state solution that I'm sure everyone in this room would say is where we need to be. And we absolutely have to be realist about the threat that Russia and China pose in security terms to our country. And so for all of those reasons, it's a progressive realist agenda, which essentially can be boiled down to one sentence. We meet the world as it is, not as we would wish it to be. Mm.
John, inevitably, people will look at the cost of defence, the 2.5% commitment. David speaking directly to the Labour commitment now to nuclear deterrent. As we know, the nuclear programme replacing Trident is drawing a lot of money out of the defence budget. There's a lot of strain in the defence budget. The Labour position still seems to be 2.5% when circumstances allow. Now, does that now provide a wedge issue for the Conservatives to say that you're actually weak because you won't commit to a date for it?
No, but it's a very important commitment and ambition. No, because I think people judge governments on what they do, not just what they say. And I don't want to quote Ben Wallace all the time, but he admitted in the House of Commons last year that over the last 14 years, his government have hollowed out and underfunded the forces. And so there is a deep legacy to recover. And the last time this country spent 2.5% of GDP on defence was in 2010 with Labour, and that's a level that's never been matched anything like in the last 14 years. So we match that 2.5% ambition. We have to increase defence spending to deal with increasing threats. And for those of you who, and many of you in this room, have deep international experience, you'll also know that in Britain we're somewhat unusual in which on defence and security all the information is known and held by government, and opposition and Parliament too often also is kept in the dark. So we will resolve this. We'll make our decisions as part of a strategic defence review that we'll conduct within the first year. And that's the way that we will be able to get to grips with the threats that we face, the capabilities we need, the state of the armed forces, and the state of the public finances once we're able to open the book. So that's the way, if you like, that we managed both the requirement for strong national security and the responsibility for sound public finances.
Wouldn't it be easier, though, just to say, yes, we'll match the 2030 target line for...
Well, do you know, that would be...
I mean, that would be 97 type Labour politics to say...
That would be easier if this had been a commitment that had been built into the government's own financial figures and forecasts. Since Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there have been 6 different autumn statements and budgets. Since Boris Johnson for the Tories first said we will spend 2.5% by 2030, there have been 5. And it's not been in any of them. None of them reached 2.5%. None of them reversed the current day-to-day real cuts that the Defence Department is dealing with. And none of them, therefore, had this new announcement or this so-called 2030 plan openly costed, independently checked, or fully funded. And if you look at what the Institute for Fiscal Studies or the Institute for Government say about this claim that Grant Shapps is going to pay for this big increase in defence funding simply by sacking 70,000 civil servants, it said that will get nowhere close to funding it. So there is work to do.
It's not properly funded.
But the ambition and the commitment, we will spend 2.5% under a Labour government on defence, because we must do that to deal with the increasing threats that we face.
In terms of threats, David, a big theme of this conference is deterrence. You've got Russia mounting that full-scale invasion 2022. You've got events going on now in the Gulf, for example, the Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. Do you think the West is looking weak? Is it failing to deter? Does the West need to do more to express its conviction in defence of certain values?
Well, if you look over my lifetime and John's lifetime, we have spent effectively half of our lives post-1990. Berlin Wall comes down, Mandela walks out of prison, globalization, free trade, seeing people lifted out of poverty in the global south. But the other half of our lives, for John, a little more than the latter half of his life, under the Cold War. A completely different context. And I think where it's now settled and understood that the geopolitical turbulence that we're seeing, the challenges that we face with war in Europe, huge challenges in the Middle East, an alliance growing between Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. I'm afraid, actually, it is the first part of our lives that should better inform our direction of travel. Now, the United Kingdom is not in a position to sort of do this alone, and it was never in a position to do this alone. But, you know, when I came into Parliament 24 years ago, our economy was bigger than China and India's combined. That is not the position today. So this, of course, is multilateral. This, of course, is with our allies and friends and partners on issues of trade, where we have to be more attendant to security issues. It's not. I wouldn't place the emphasis on free trade. I would place the emphasis on trusted trade with trusted partners, if you see what I mean, to have the critical minerals, to ensure that you've got a small yard and a high fence, as Jake Sullivan has set out in the White House, to attend to issues on defence, which is why we've got the UK-EU Security Pact as a very important offer to the European Union. So yes, this is a challenging time, but I do believe for our country, with a seat, P5 nation, important G7 nation, sixth richest economy in the world, of course we play an important role, not just on behalf of our own nation, but on behalf of the values and the freedoms that were hard won in the Second World War.
The short answer to your question is yes. The UK needs to do more, the West needs to do more, exactly as David has said. We need to spend more on defence, but how well we spend it counts just as much as how much we spend. We need to do more to support Ukraine now. We need to do more through NATO now, because we have to deter the next decade of likely Russian aggression, particularly if Putin prevails in Ukraine. And if he does prevail, that will be taken as the West being weak, not just seeming weak, by Russia, by China, by Iran, by North Korea. So this could not be more important, and it could not be a more critical moment, as the Ukrainians described us to us when we were in Kyiv last week.
I'm going to follow up with one quick question, John, and then I'll open up to a couple from the floor. Given David's point about the sweep of history and the relative change in economic strength of a country like the UK vis-a-vis a country like China, to what extent do you worry that we are historically on a downward track and simply unable in the longer term to afford the kind of defences that would establish or re-establish deterrence in that sense?
So I worry about the state of our armed forces, and we have strong armed forces ready to fight, or need them ready to fight, to deter the very fights that we hope we can avoid. But in the end, for Britain, our allies are our strategic strength. So it's our membership of NATO, an expanded, strengthened NATO since Putin's invasion, which counts. It's the alliances and special agreements that we have, for instance, with Australia and the US over AUKUS, and some of the partnerships in the Indo-Pacific that are part of strengthening them and strengthening ourselves. And in the end, that's why you can't have an MOD making decisions about the armed forces and defence in its bunker. You have to have a defence playing a significant role in a successful country and a successful government, and why you have to have a Foreign Office and an MOD working very closely together.
Right. Lady there.
Hi, I'm Celia Parker-Vincent. I'm a PhD candidate here at King's, looking at leadership of the UK's intelligence community. I've got a question about whether you're intending to retain the national security structures put in place by Cameron and the coalition government in 2010, namely the National Security Advisor and the National Security Council.
Yes, they were an important innovation after 2010. You will know better than anyone, better than us. They've worked better during certain periods than others. Largely, as a result of the leadership and interest and direction a Prime Minister gives to those arrangements. And I can tell you, Keir Starmer will be no Boris Johnson.
It didn't meet all that often, did it, the National Security Council at certain times in the last few years? Further question. Sorry, David, you didn't want to come back.
No, it's fine.
Further question.
and I'm Flynn MacLeod. Hello, John. David, I have a bit of a problem with your desire to have a defence review and take 100 days or nearly a year to do it, because effectively we're going to a period where we'll have a year of nothing happening in the MOD. If you've been in the room this morning, you would have heard there is no time. We all know there is no time. Having a defence review done by the same people, reviewing the same things, coming with the same answers, is not going to get us any much further forwards. Can you not be a bit more bold and not only say commit yourself to 2.5%, but 3% of GDP, and also actually indicate some areas where you would like to do some proper defence spending, like, say, air defence for our major cities?
Well, Caroline Grant-Shapps says the same thing as you do. Although his own department is preparing for a fresh review, and his own minister has said the House of Commons, in response actually to the former chair of the Select Committee, what an excellent idea. Look, if this was, it is necessary. It's especially necessary for a new government for some of the reasons that I've explained. If this was just the same thing, done by the same people, coming to the same conclusions and taking the same length of time, then it would be a mistake. That's not what's needed. That's not what will happen if we get into government.
Sorry, this here and then here in the centre, yeah.
Thanks very much. Paul from the Royal Air Force. I'm heartened that you've been to Ukraine recently and you recognise the Blitz spirit, which is a link back to the Battle of Britain spirit, certainly. Lessons identified from the Ukraine war. Are we going to be learning the right lessons? Are we witnessing the rise and fall of the drone? And I link back to the point that was very well made there. Do we need to take our integrated air and missile defence seriously for the next integrated and defence review? Thank you.
Yes, we need to take it seriously. Yes, we have to learn the lessons. They seem to me from the outside to be partially being taken on board, but we're still too slow in the way that we commission the weaponry and that we need. It took 287 days for ministers to sign a contract for new NLAWs, the shoulder-fired anti-tank missiles that were so important to Ukraine in the early days, and over 500 days to sign new contracts for new ammunition. So we've got to speed that up. Some of the work that we in the UK are doing with Ukraine is really groundbreaking. It's groundbreaking in the technology, it's groundbreaking in the pace at which things are being developed and delivered. The dislocation is the way that we're taking those back as demonstrations of what we can do if we're determined enough within our own system. And that seems to me the challenge, and it's why recently I did a speech on reform of defence, which is in political circles not everybody's cup of tea and certainly not a headline grabber. But ultimately, Ukraine tells us that if we continue doing what we've always done in the same ways, not just with the strength and state of our armed forces, but the strength and state of our industry, then we will fail to put in place the sort of deterrence that we need over the next decade, particularly to deal with the Russian aggression.
Gentleman there.
Good morning, Joshua Huminski, Senior Vice President at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress in Washington. Mr. Urban briefly raised the prospect of the forthcoming election in November in the United States, and without necessarily commenting on the politics of Washington at the moment, how do you see the relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom evolving potentially under a forthcoming Labour government?
Oh, look, the starting point is to say that the special relationship is real. Combined across the Five Eyes system, we have the best intelligence capability in the world. We saw over Israel and Jordan just a few weeks ago what our effort with our partners can achieve. Had those missiles fallen on civilian populations in Israel and Jordan, we would be having a slightly different conversation today. So whoever is in the White House, whoever is in number 10 that partnership is key. What I detect when I'm in Washington, and I think I've been 7 times and since taking up this post, is that on China, there is an increasingly bipartisan position, which is important for us to understand. I think it is important that the US has a dialogue with the UK, with the EU in terms of their Trade and Tech Council, which increasingly is looking at security issues. I'm worried that the UK is sitting out of that. We haven't got structured dialogue, and that's going to be very important going forward. I've seen the decisions that are being made on electric vehicles, for example. That's hugely important. So, look, I think that let's see, what the democratic moment produces in the United States. But I have been very keen to emphasize that we will work with whomever is elected. And yeah, I'm happy to say that there are parts of my politics that are small c conservative. I'm a Christian, for example. I believe in family, and I can, sitting with someone like J.D. Vance, talking about the tough challenges in rural Ohio aren't that far removed from the tough challenges in my constituency or indeed John's. So you can find common cause, and it's absolutely up to us as politicians to seek to do that.
Excellent. We are having to wind up, I'm afraid, because time is against us. But on that idea of a common cause, I hope you'll join me in thanking our 2 speakers very much.